The bride walks into church in a white dress, but hidden in her pocket is her mother's silver knife. Do you want to know why? The morning sun angled low through the schoolhouse window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor where Sarah Whitmore stood in her mother's wedding dress. The brass buttons down the front caught light like small mirrors, each one reflecting a fragment of the world she was about to leave behind. The clock on the mantelpiece showed 7:30, 2 hours, until the binding rope would circle her wrists. Sarah, child. Mrs. Henderson, the schoolmarm, set down her Bible and moved toward the window. Your father's coming up the path. Sarah pressed her fingertips against the cool glass. Beyond the schoolyard, the town of Cedar Ridge stretched along the valley floor, its buildings arranged like grave markers in neat rows. The church bell tower rose above them all, its bronze dome catching the early light. In 2 hours, that bell would ring for her punishment, wedding a ceremony older than Colorado Territory itself. Her father's boots struck the wooden steps with the measured pace of a man carrying duty like stones in his pockets. Thomas Whitmore entered without knocking, his face drawn tight with the weight of the past 3 months. Time to go, Sarah. He held a length of hemp rope coiled in his weathered hands. Judge Carver's waiting at the church. The rope was pale gold in the morning light, woven tight and strong, thick enough to bind a woman's wrists without cutting the skin, soft enough to suggest mercy where none existed. Sarah had watched her father work those knots every evening since the trial, his fingers moving with the precision of a man who'd spent 40 years breaking horses and mending harness. The marriage papers? Sarah asked. Though she knew the answer, signed and witnessed. Thomas's voice carried no comfort. The law's the law, child. Been the law since before you were born. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her small hands smoothing the wrinkles from Sarah's skirt. The custom served us well enough when the territory was wild, she said quietly. A woman who bears a child without marriage brings shame to the whole settlement. The binding wedding makes it right in God's eyes. And if the father won't claim the child, then the town provides a husband. Thomas's jaw worked against words he wouldn't speak. Marcus Brennan's a good man. He'll treat you fair. Sarah turned back to the window. Across the street, the general store was opening for business. Mrs. Keller swept dust from her front steps while her husband arranged canned goods in the window display. A normal morning in a normal town, except for the woman in white who would walk to her wedding with her hands bound like a criminal. The church bell struck 8 times, its bronze voice carrying across the valley. 1 hour remaining. I need to fetch something from home, Sarah said. A piece of my mother's jewelry for luck. Thomas frowned. We don't have time for 10 minutes. Sarah lifted her chin with a stubbornness that reminded him of his late wife. The preacher won't start without the bride. Mrs. Henderson nodded toward the door. Go on, Thomas. I'll watch over her. But Sarah was already moving, her white skirts rustling against the doorframe as she stepped into the morning air. The schoolhouse sat on the edge of town where the buildings gave way to grassland and scattered pines. Her family's cabin lay a 1/4 mile beyond, its roof visible through the trees. She walked quickly, her shoes raising small clouds of dust from the worn path. The morning air carried scents of pine sap and wood smoke, familiar smells that would soon belong to memory. By noon, she would be Marcus Brennan's wife, her shame covered by marriage, but never erased. The cabin stood empty and quiet, its windows dark with her father's absence. Sarah pushed through the front door and moved directly to her mother's dresser, a piece of furniture her father had built during their first winter in Colorado. The bottom drawer held her mother's few precious things, a cameo brooch, a pair of pearl earrings, and beneath them all, wrapped in tissue paper, a folded letter. Sarah's hands trembled as she unfolded the yellowed paper. The ink had faded, but the words remained clear. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then the old law has claimed you as it claimed me 23 years ago. Your father knows the truth, but has never spoken it. The binding wedding is not God's law, child. It is man's law, written by those who fear women's choices. There is another way, but it requires courage your mother never possessed. Look for the stranger at Keller's store. He carries what you need. Your loving mother, Elizabeth. The letter fell from Sarah's fingers as footsteps sounded on the front porch. Through the window, she saw a man in a dark coat approaching the cabin. Not her father, but someone she'd never seen before. Tall and lean, with silver threading his brown hair, he moved with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to traveling alone. "Miss Whitmore?" His voice carried a southern accent, softened by years of wandering. "My name is Daniel Reed. Your mother wrote to me before she died." Sarah stepped onto the porch, her white dress bright against the cabin's weathered logs. The stranger's horse stood tied to the fence, post a fine bay mare with silver-trimmed tack that spoke of money and careful planning. "You knew my mother?" "I knew her story." Daniel Reed removed his hat, revealing eyes the color of winter sky. "Elizabeth Whitmore wasn't the first woman bound by this town's law, and you won't be the last unless someone cuts the rope that holds the whole custom together." The church bells struck the quarter hour. 45 minutes until the ceremony. "I don't understand." Daniel reached into his coat and withdrew a knife, not a common blade, but a Spanish steel with silver inlay along the handle. "This belonged to your mother's father, a man who understood that laws written by frightened men deserve no reverence. Elizabeth asked me to bring it to you when the time came." Sarah stared at the knife, its blade catching sunlight like water. "What am I supposed to do with this?" "Cut the rope." His voice held no trace of jest. "In front of the whole town, when the preacher calls for the binding, cut it clean and walk away. They'll arrest me. Judge Carver will. Judge Carver's authority comes from the territorial government, and the territorial government answers to federal law. A woman cannot be forced into marriage, not even here." Daniel stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But someone has to be the first to say no. Someone has to cut the rope." The sound of approaching horses carried across the grassland. Sarah looked toward town and saw dust rising from the main street, her father and the others coming to collect her for the ceremony. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help me?" Daniel Reed smiled, and for the first time his face showed something beyond duty. "Because 23 years ago I stood in a church in Kansas and watched a woman I loved walk down the aisle with her hands bound. I was too young and too afraid to cut the rope. I've carried that weight ever since." The horses were closer now. Sarah could make out her father's grey gelding and Judge Carver's black mare. Behind them rode Marcus Brennan on his chestnut stallion, the man who would become her husband unless she found the courage her mother had lacked. Sarah took the knife, its weight solid and real in her palm. The silver inlay felt warm against her skin, as if it held some trace of the grandfather she'd never known. "Will you stay?" she asked. "To see it through?" "I'll be there." Daniel touched the brim of his hat. "In the back of the church, near the door. When you cut the rope, walk toward me, and don't look back." The riders were close enough now that Sarah could hear the jingle of harness and the soft conversation between the men. She slipped the knife into the pocket of her wedding dress, feeling its outline press against the white silk. "Miss Whitmore." Her father's voice carried across the yard. "Time to go." Sarah walked down from the porch, her chin high and her steps steady. Thomas Whitmore sat his horse with the bearing of a man who'd made peace with hard choices, but his eyes searched her face as if looking for some sign of the child she'd been. "You ready, daughter?" "I'm ready, Pa." Judge Carver, a thin man with grey whiskers and wire-rimmed spectacles, consulted his pocket watch. 8:30. We'll have you wed and properly bound before the sun reaches full height." Marcus Brennan guided his horse alongside Sarah's path, his face kind but distant. He was a good man, as her father had said, a blacksmith with steady work and a clean reputation. Under different circumstances, she might have chosen him freely, but choice was not part of this morning's ceremony. "Sarah." Marcus touched his hat brim. "You look beautiful." She nodded but said nothing. The knife in her pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step toward town. The church sat in the center of Cedar Ridge like a white stone dropped into still water. Its bell tower rose 40 feet above the main street, visible from every corner of the settlement. As they approached, Sarah could see townspeople gathering on the front steps, women in their Sunday dresses and men in pressed shirts, all come to witness the binding wedding that would make her shame into righteousness. Mrs. Keller from the general store waved from the crowd. "Beautiful morning for a wedding, Sarah." "The Lord provides," added Pastor Morrison, though his voice carried no joy. He was a young man, new to the territory, and Sarah suspected he'd never performed a binding ceremony before. The church doors stood open, revealing rows of wooden pews filled with familiar faces. At the front, near the altar, Sarah could see the small table where the binding rope waited alongside the marriage papers. Everything prepared according to custom, according to law. But in the back of the church, near the door, a stranger in a dark coat sat alone in the shadows. Thomas helped Sarah down from the wagon, his hands gentle on her arms. "You'll do fine, child. Just remember, this is for the best." "Yes, Pa." Judge Carver cleared his throat and addressed the gathered crowd. "Friends and neighbors, we are here this morning to witness the binding marriage of Sarah Whitmore and Marcus Brennan, according to the laws and customs of our territory. Let all who object speak now, or forever hold their peace." The crowd remained silent. A meadowlark called from the grassland beyond town, its song bright and free in the morning air. "Then let us proceed." Sarah walked up the church steps with her father on one side and Marcus on the other. Her white dress rustled against the wooden planks, and somewhere behind her she heard Mrs. Henderson whisper a prayer. The knife in her pocket pressed against her hip with each step, a secret weight that made her movements deliberate and sure. Inside the church, the air was cool and still. Sunlight slanted through the stained glass windows, painting colored shadows on the floor. The binding rope lay coiled on the altar table like a sleeping snake, its hemp fibers pale gold in the filtered light. Pastor Morrison opened his Bible and began to speak, his young voice carrying clearly through the small church. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and this community to join Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore and Marcus James Brennan in holy matrimony and to bind the bride according to the ancient custom that protects the honor of our settlement." Sarah felt the eyes of the congregation upon her, their collective gaze heavy as winter wool. These were people she'd known all her life, neighbors who'd brought food when her mother died, friends who'd taught her to read and cipher and make preserves from wild berries. They were good people, but they were bound by the same fears that had created the rope now waiting on the altar. "Sarah Whitmore," Pastor Morrison continued, "you have transgressed against the moral law of this community by bearing a child outside the bonds of marriage. Do you accept this binding as just punishment for your sin, and do you willingly submit to marriage with Marcus Brennan as prescribed by our custom?" The moment had come. Sarah's hand moved to her pocket, her fingers closing around the knife handle. In the back of the church, Daniel Reed sat motionless in the shadows, his winter sky eyes fixed upon her face. "I do not," Sarah said clearly. A murmur ran through the congregation like wind through dry grass. Pastor Morrison blinked, his finger marking the place in his prayer book. "I beg your pardon, Miss Whitmore." Sarah stepped forward, withdrawing the Spanish blade from her pocket. The silver inlay caught the light from the stained glass windows, throwing small rainbows across the wooden altar. "I said, I do not accept this binding as just. I do not accept this punishment as godly. And I do not consent to this marriage." Judge Carver rose from his front row pew, his face darkening. "Young woman, you are in contempt of this court and this community. Put down that knife and submit to the law." "Whose law?" Sarah moved toward the altar table where the binding rope waited. "Show me where it's written in Scripture that a woman must marry against her will. Show me where Christ commanded that shame be bound with hemp and hidden behind false vows." Her father stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Sarah, child, don't do this. You'll bring ruin on us all." "No, Pa." Sarah lifted the knife, its blade gleaming in the colored light. "I'll bring freedom." She brought the Spanish steel down on the binding rope, its sharp edge slicing through hemp fibers like they were made of spider silk. The rope fell in two pieces, its coils collapsing against the altar table with a soft whisper. The church erupted in voices, some shouting condemnation, others calling for order. But through the chaos, Sarah heard a single sound that cut through all the rest. The slow, steady clapping of hands from the back of the church. Daniel Reed stood and walked down the center aisle, his applause echoing off the wooden walls. "Well done, Miss Whitmore. Your mother would be proud." Judge Carver sputtered with rage. "Arrest her! She's destroyed public property and defied a court order." "What court order?" Daniel reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. I represent the Territorial Attorney General's office. As of yesterday, all binding marriage laws in Colorado Territory have been ruled unconstitutional under federal statutes. Any attempt to force a woman into marriage is now a federal crime. He handed the paper to Judge Carver, whose face went pale as he read the official seal and signature. "This changes nothing," the judge said. But his voice had lost its authority. "The woman has still borne a child out of wedlock. She's disgraced herself and this community." Sarah looked out over the congregation, seeing faces she'd known since childhood, some angry, some confused, but others thoughtful. In the third row, young Mary Patterson met her eyes and nodded slightly, understanding passing between them like a shared secret. "I made a choice," Sarah said, her voice carrying to every corner of the church. "I chose love over safety, and I chose to bear a child rather than hide from the consequences. If that's disgrace, then I wear it proudly." She walked toward the back of the church, her white dress bright against the dark wooden pews. Some people turned away as she passed, but others, Mrs. Henderson, the midwife, Mrs. Carter, even old Mr. Daniels from the livery stable nodded their respect. At the door, Daniel Reed offered his arm. "Ready to go?" "Where?" "Anywhere you choose. That's what freedom means." Sarah looked back once at the altar, where the severed rope lay in two pieces. Marcus Brennan stood beside it, his face showing relief rather than disappointment. Perhaps he, too, understood that marriage should be chosen, not imposed. Her father remained in his front row pew, his shoulders slumped with the weight of old beliefs. But as Sarah watched, he slowly raised his head and met her eyes. What she saw there wasn't anger or shame, it was pride, mixed with a grief for the daughter he was losing and the woman she was becoming. "Go on, child," he said quietly. "Your mother's spirit is in you. I see that now." Sarah stepped through the church doors into the bright Colorado morning. The sun had climbed higher while the drama played out inside, and now it painted the main street in shades of gold and amber. A few townspeople had followed them outside, their faces curious rather than hostile. Mrs. Keller approached from the general store, her hands dusty with flour. "Sarah, dear, where will you go?" "West," Sarah said, the word tasting like possibility on her tongue. "There's a teacher's college in California that accepts unmarried women. I have some money saved." And she glanced at Daniel Reed. "I believe I have help for the journey. The child," Sarah placed her hand over her still flat stomach, "will grow up free to choose their own path, whatever that may be." Daniel Reed helped her into his wagon, which he'd retrieved from behind the church during the ceremony. The bay mare stamped impatiently, eager to be moving. "One last thing," Sarah called to the crowd gathered on the church steps. She pulled the marriage papers from the altar table, documents that would have bound her to a man she didn't love and a life she didn't choose. With careful deliberation, she tore them in half and let the pieces flutter to the ground like autumn leaves. "For any woman who comes after me," she said, "remember that ropes can be cut and papers can be torn. The only binding that matters is the one you choose for yourself." As they drove out of Cedar Ridge, Sarah looked back to see the church bell tower growing smaller against the mountains. The bell had fallen silent after the ceremony's disruption, but its bronze voice would ring again for other weddings, hopefully weddings chosen rather than commanded. The wagon wheels found their rhythm on the westward road, and the morning sun climbed toward its zenith. Somewhere behind them, a town was learning that old laws could be broken and new ones could be born. Somewhere ahead, California waited with schools that taught women to think and choose and lead. Sarah Whitmore had cut the binding rope and walked away from shame, disguised as righteousness. Now she rode toward a future she would write herself, one choice at a time, 1 mile at a time, 1 day at a time. The road west stretched before them, wide and free and full of possibility. If something in this story touched you, linger with us. We'll handle the rest.